वन्दे वेदान्तकर्पूर चामीकरकरण्डकम् रामानुजार्यमार्याणाम् चूडामणिमहर्निशम्.
Good morning, everybody. Our speaker today, Professor Francis Xavier Clooney, is Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. We are honored and extremely happy to welcome him to our center and to have him talk to us on learning from Ramanuja, a subject he himself has been studying for over 40 years. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago in 1984, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before going to Harvard, which he joined in 2005. He is a Roman Catholic priest and has been a member of the Society of Jesus for 50 years. He serves regularly in a Catholic parish on weekends. From 2002 to 2016, he blogged regularly in the In All Things section of America Magazine Online and on his current blog site, The Inner Edge. His primary areas of Indological scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India. He's also a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning, deepened through the study of traditions other than one's own. He has also written on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, on the early Jesuit Pan-Asian discourse on reincarnation, and on the dynamics of dialogue and interreligious learning in the contemporary world. Hailed as a founder of modern comparative theology, Professor Clooney was given the 2017 John Courtney Murray Award for Distinguished Theological Achievement from the Catholic Theological Society of America. In July 2010, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and has served as a professorial research fellow at the Australian Catholic University. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University. Professor Clooney is the author of numerous articles and books, including Thinking Ritually, Retrieving the Purva Mimamsa of Jaimini, Theology After Vedanta, an experiment in comparative theology, and more recently, he has co-edited How to Do Comparative Theology from Fordham University Press 2017, The Future of Hindu-Christian Studies, A Theological Inquiry, Routledge 2017, and Learning Interreligiously in the Text in the World, Fortius 2018. He is currently writing shorter essays on the Manual of Daily Worship, Nityam, by the Hindu theologian Ramanuja, and on Constantine Beshi, S.J., a Jesuit missionary in South India in the 18th century. And just in September of this year, Professor Clooney released his latest book, Reading the Hindu and Christian Classics, Why and How Deep Learning Still Matters, University of Virginia Press. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Clooney.
So I'm glad that I urged Diane to give the short introduction, not the long one. She's very kind. So I must begin by saying I have great pleasure in being here at the Vedanta Society. In the past months, Swami Sarvapriyananda has become a good friend already in his time visiting Harvard University. And it's a pleasure for me, we had arranged this even before we knew that Swami was coming to Boston, but it's a pleasure for me to come and visit you here. It's also nice for me to come home because I was born in Brooklyn, grew up on Staten Island, went to high school at Regis High School right across the park, and university at Fordham University in the Bronx. So it's always good to come back and to be here with you. I also have a special word of thanks for the security arrangements today. Normally when I travel, we don't have that heavy security, but the police at every corner have made me feel better about coming here today. And I know that you're no danger to me. That's another thing that I can appreciate. And I also have not a long history with the Ramakrishna order and the monks. Swami Tyagananda in Boston has been a friend of mine since the early 90s. When I visited Mylapore in Madras, and I used to cycle over to the mutt in Mylapore, and we'd have long conversations. And I told him how wonderful it would be for him someday to come and be the Swami in Boston. And lo and behold, he showed up in Boston. And around the same time, I was invited several times to Gold Park, Swami Lokeshwarananda. I used to take the train up from Madras because I'd see more of the countryside, and he was a gracious host in those days, and happy to visit Dakshineshwar and Belur Mutt, and other such occasions. So it's always a long-term happy connection for me, and I think in part inspired particularly by Sri Ramakrishna himself, and this kind of sense of the vastness of God's possibilities and the vastness of God's presence in the world, and that nothing is outside God's divine energy within the world. And that, for me, I think has always been an inspiration, even in the work that I do. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. I must say, it seems a little bit odd to have the topic of learning from Sri Ramanuja here today. I was recently in Geneva, in Switzerland, the home of John Calvin. And John Calvin was one of the great reformers and the enemy of the Jesuits and the enemy of the Catholic Church. It's sort of like bringing John Calvin to Rome to talk about John Calvin at St. Peter's or something like that. Why would you do that? And I know that the Vedanta Society, the Ramakrishna order, is deeply rooted in the works of Shankara. And I understand that because my first love was Shankara. When I studied even Purva Mimamsa, which I did in graduate school, partly the point was to be better able to read Shankara, to go back and see some of the precedents in the Mimamsa tradition. And I think it's hard, it would be almost impossible to find a thinker more brilliant, more concise, and more powerful, bringing out the meaning of the Upanishads than Shankara. And it's a little bit odd then, at first I was thinking to come here and speak about Ramanuja, who in some, caricature versions is seen kind of as a rival to Shankara. Which side are you on? Are you for the Advaita or the Vishishtadvaita? But I was encouraged when I started, preparing for coming here today to realize that there's been a long and respectful understanding of Ramanuja in the Vedanta Society. I was looking at there's a beautiful biography of Ramanuja, translated from the Bengali, Swami Ramakrishnananda, done many years ago in Bengali and then revised and brought out in English later on. But in his introduction to that beautiful volume on Ramanuja, supremely glorious and large-hearted, Sri Ramanuja is among the foremost of the Mahatmas. The path shown by him is established on sattva alone. Not being unsteady and fleeting like those resting on rajas and tamas, this yields everlasting results. All who aspire to share in the ever-abiding supreme bliss should follow in the footsteps of magnanimous ones like Bhagavan Sri Ramanuja. There is no other way but this. The rich and the poor, the erudite and the unlettered, the high and the low, all can tread the path shown by this Mahatma with great ease and much benefit. So a high tribute for Ramanuja and his role in India. And then even more basically, I was going through the works of Swami Vivekananda and wondering what he had to say about Ramanuja. And this is something we could talk about later, but I have two quotes here from him that are very impressive to me. One is from an essay or a lecture called The Historical Evolution of India. The movement of Shankara forced its way by its high intellectuality. But it could be of little service to the masses because of its adherence to strict caste laws, very small scope for ordinary emotion, and by making Sanskrit the only vehicle of communication. Ramanuja, on the other hand, with a most practical philosophy, a great appeal to the emotions, an entire denial of birthrights before spiritual attainments, and appeals through the popular tongue, completely succeeded in bringing the masses back to Vedic religion. Now, much more could be said about this judgment, but I was very impressed that Vivekananda himself had such a high esteem for the positivity and practicality of Ramanuja's approach. Or in another essay, The Sages of India, he says this: after Shankara came the brilliant Ramanuja. Shankara, with his great intellect, I am afraid, was not as great a heart. Ramanuja's heart was all the greater. He felt for the downtrodden, he sympathized with the poor, he took up the ceremonies, the accretions that had been gathered, made them pure as far as they could be, and instituted new ceremonies, new methods of worship for the people who absolutely required such things. At the same time, he opened the door to the highest spiritual worship from Brahman to the pariah. That was Ramanuja's achievement. Again, this is high praise from Swamiji. So I feel a little bit better now. It's not really like talking about John Calvin at the Vatican, but nonetheless a way of understanding the role that we have with Ramanuja, how his Vedanta is in some sense complementary to and opens the door to understanding all Vedanta and the Upanishads better. So what I'd like to do is go through a number of points about what I have learned from Ramanuja and why I've appreciated him over the decades. And then I know that Swami said we could have some questions and discussion, which I look forward to. As he knows from my classes, I'm usually more interested in the questions and discussion than in what I have to say. So I will definitely leave time so that you may bring forward points, large or small, about how we go. Ramanuja is an interesting person because he has a living tradition connected with him that is quite lively in India. If any of you have been to Hyderabad recently, in the last few years, you'll know that there is now a giant Ramanuja statue at the ashram there of the Chinnajir Swami, one of the Sri Vaishnava Swamis, a 216-foot high statue of Ramanuja sitting in a yoga position, carrying his staff, surrounded now by the 108 Divyadeshas of the Sri Vaishnavas. And so you can come there with replicas of the Murtis in the temple, and you can go around Sri Ramanuja in his shadow, as it were, and visit all the Divyadeshas of the Sri Vaishnavas. And the Swami, I was there for the 1000th birth anniversary conference for Ramanuja several years ago. And he explained to me, but also he kept explaining to all those who had come, that he thought Ramanuja is a useful, important figure for 21st century India. When there are so many challenges facing the Indian people, when Hinduism is rethinking its future in India and globally, Ramanuja, he thought, has a very positive role to play, as I think Vivekananda saw a long time ago. And his motto was that what we need in India today is a respect for other people's ways of worship. And as he put it in very simple terms, practice your own and respect others. Respect everyone's way of learning. And he sees that Ramanuja, with his sense of the vernacular, sense of popular religion, sense of opening the door to everyone, is actually a wonderful figure for 21st century India. He's not exclusive in saying only Ramanuja, but nonetheless that he's a figure who can help people to understand in the 21st century. Ramanuja, the stories about him that go back to nearly his lifetime are quite extraordinary. There was one when he was a student only. His teacher was Yadava Prakasha, a great teacher of Vedanta, but a very strict teacher. And there was one scene where it's hard to imagine today this kind of taking place. The teacher was teaching and Ramanuja was there rubbing his feet. And somehow this was the dakshin, the fee that he had to pay to be there with Swami. And there was a passage from the Chandogya Upanishad, which I won't go into the details, interpreting the verse, where the Yadava Prakasha is giving this teaching. And Ramanuja says nothing, he just keeps doing what he's been asked to do. But suddenly Yadava Prakasha feels hot tears on his foot. And he looks down and says, "What's wrong with you?" And Ramanuja said, the way you have interpreted this passage about Brahman, the color of Brahman, the nature of Brahman, is so offensive and so misleading and misunderstanding the truth of what the passage in Chandogya is saying, I could not but weep. And the teacher is surprised. And being a harsh, strong teacher, he said, well, then get out of here. And they were reconciled several times, but he kept being annoyed because Ramanuja would constantly correct him and say, dear teacher, you don't quite understand how to read the Upanishads, it seems. And there was even one story, I don't know if there's any historical basis to it, that Yadava Prakasha suggested to Ramanuja that they go on a pilgrimage, I think to Kashi, and that on the way he planned to have these men burst out of the forest and kill him. So this was quite a tense relationship. And they parted company after that. Ramanuja was saved by some hunters who took him off and restored him to safety. And eventually they were reconciled, but it was a strange thing. And then the other story, the more famous story, Tirukoshtior Nambi was a Vaishnava teacher who Ramanuja esteemed greatly, always esteemed greatly, and wanted to learn from. And he wanted to know the Tiru mantra, the holy mantra of the Sri Vaishnavas, which is a very simple mantra, very simple words. And he went to Tirukoshtior Nambi to ask for the mantra and its true meaning, and he sent him away. He went back, he sent him away, third time sent him away. 18 times he came to Tirukoshtior Nambi to ask for the mantra and the meaning of the mantra. And finally he said, well, I guess you're serious, you really do want this. And so he comes there the 18th time and says, I will tell you the mantra, and I will give you its esoteric meaning if you swear on the pain of going to hell that you will never tell anyone. And so Ramanuja says, yes, Master, I will make that promise to you. And so he gives the mantra, whispers it in his ear, finally gives it to Ramanuja. And the story is, and I think there's a basis in truth, it's hard to tell all the details, but Ramanuja goes back to Sri Rangam, to the great temple in Sri Rangam, and goes up on the balcony and starts shouting out the Tiru mantra as loud as he can so that everyone can hear. And if you go to Sri Rangam today, there's always this recording of Om Namo Narayanaya, Om Namo Narayanaya, all the time. And he wants everyone to know the mantra, which is salvific and has great power and purifies their lives. And Tirukoshtior Nambi hears about this, and he is furious, and he calls him back, and he has to go back and said, you told me that you would not tell anyone. Do you realize that you've now damned yourself to hell? And Ramanuja says, but my job in life was to make salvation available to as many as possible. And if the price of that salvation is that I myself would be lost, it's worth it. And then one version of the story is, and then Tirukoshtior Nambi felt so embarrassed, he reached down and touched the feet of Ramanuja. But there is this sense, and it comes up in the Vivekananda quotes that I gave you, Ramanuja trying to open the religion and make it available to everyone. And that, I think, is very interesting. The background, of course, is that in Tamil Nadu, where Ramanuja was, he was born in a place called Sri Perumbudur, outside Madras. Tragically, the place where Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated back in the 90s. But there at Sri Perumbudur, in the Tamil country. And in the background, although Ramanuja writes only in Sanskrit language, there's a sense that he grew up in a Tamil culture, a beautiful Tamil culture, but also where in the centuries just before him, there had been the beautiful works of the Alvars. 12 saints, including Tirumangai Alvar, Poigai Alvar, Tirumarisai Paran, and so on. Andal, the great woman poet, and most of all, Namalvar, Shatakopan. And so the 4,000 verses nearly of the Alvars became so important in the Tamil country in the generations before Ramanuja. There's a story that they were lost at one point, and that they had been forgotten, and that Nadamuni, great teacher Nadamuni, who was the teacher of Ramanuja's teacher, he heard like a fragment of it that referred to the 1,000 verses of Namalvar. And he kept asking around, and nobody knew about the rest of the 1,000 verses. So he took what he had, and he just kept repeating it. And again, the story is repeated 1,000 times or more. And finally, Namalvar came to him and gave him the entire corpus of the Alvar's works. I think the point is that they were lost and then recovered. And then Ramanuja's direct teacher of sort, Yamuna, or Alavandar, then continued by writing again in Sanskrit, but to try to bring out the deeper meaning of the Alvar poetry, the Vaishnava poetry, heartfelt devotion, seeking after God, beautiful, beautiful fusions of the soul. And although Ramanuja didn't actually study with Yamuna, came to him only after his death, and by tradition, Yamuna had his 3 fingers on his chest, knowing that Ramanuja would come after his death. And I think it was to do a commentary on the Brahma Sutras, a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, and then to make sure that the works of the Alvars were passed along. And so there's this tradition in which Ramanuja functions of beautiful Tamil poetry, Vaishnava poetry, and then on the other side, being a learned Brahmin and having the learned sense of Vedanta, how to maintain and truly understand the tradition of the Upanishads, the Veda, the Bhagavad Gita, and all the Mimamsa, Uttara Mimamsa Vedanta tradition. And the story that is generally told about him is that Ramanuja committed himself to try to hold together the entirety of both the Veda in Sanskrit and the Tamil works, the Divya Prabandham of the Alvars. And that his project right from the start had this double nature to it. Tamil, the vernacular language that people spoke every day, and Sanskrit that would be more precious and limited to only a few people. How to go back and forth between the vernacular and the Sanskrit, the vernacular and the Sanskrit. And although he never himself wrote anything in Tamil, we don't have anything, even spurious works attributed to him, there's a sense that he built the context at the Sri Rangam temple in particular, where there would be a place for the recitation of the Alvar's works in the temple. They'd be integrated into the puja of the daily temple's life and then the festivals during the year. The Pancharatra tradition of temple worship would be connected with the works of the Alvars, and that he was a great administrator and organizer and created the space in which the works of the Alvars could be part of everyday life for the Vaishnava. The ultimate form of that teaching became what was called as the Ubhaya Vedanta, the Vedanta of, in 2 languages, the double Vedanta. And the point didn't seem to be no claim that the works of the Alvars were a literal translation of the Rig Veda, Samaveda, Upanishads into Tamil, but that the same Lord who spoke in Sanskrit also spoke in Tamil. And that if you understand the brilliance of the Sanskrit, the brilliance of the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, and take them deeply into your heart, then on the other side, if you learn the Alvar's works and you memorize those and you sing those, you realize these are 2 lights shed on the same truth. And that these are not in competition with one another. It's not, as you see in some of the 20th century figures in Tamil Nadu, the Dravidian movement and so on, where there was tension, anti-Brahminical movements and so on like that, which is another story. Nonetheless, that you could go back and forth between the Tamil and the Sanskrit, and you could see them both together. And I think when Swami Ramakrishnananda and Swami Vivekananda and then modern teachers talk about kind of the democratic impulse of Ramanuja, they're in part talking about the fact that he welcomed the vernacular and all that went with it. So not just the language, but the poetry, all the temples, the murtis in the temple, the positive imagery of Rama, Krishna, Sri Lakshmi, and so on. All of this became part of his vision of Vedanta. And so I think it'd be a misunderstanding of Ramanuja to think that he just sat down and read Chandogya Upanishad or Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and decided to invent Vishishtadvaita. But rather the impulse was out of his own role, being a Vaishnava in Tamil Nadu, that there was the sense that I am a devotee of the Lord, I place myself at the feet of the Lord, I recite the Tira mantra, but I will not abandon the heritage of Sanskrit, or the heritage where my people have come from in that way. And so the ability to go back and forth between the 2 became very important for him. And as the tradition developed, and every Vaishnava, Sri Vaishnava even today, points back and says they're indebted to Ramanuja as making it possible for people to be practicing Vaishnavas, to go to the temple, to do the pujas, to worship in a very common way with other people, and also love the Upanishads, love the Veda, love the Bhagavad Gita, and the ability to do both. And I think that is extremely important for him. And philosophically, and I won't go too deep into the philosophy, there are other points I'd like to make, is that what he tried to do was to show that if you truly understand the Vedanta and truly understand the Upanishads and the philosophy of them, you realize that they are talking about the same reality that the Tamil poetry is talking about. And so there is a way in which, as a Catholic or a Christian might say, God is in all things. God is everywhere. And that the point of learning the Vedanta is that you come to see God more clearly. He even has several of his well-known philosophical points point in this direction. Everything is chit achit Ishvara. And it's a basic claim that everything in the world, as in Chandogya, comes forth from the one, Bahusyam, may I become many. And his understanding was that everything, chit achit, things with consciousness, from Brahma, the chief of the gods, down to the blade of grass and so on, and all inanimate things are all manifestations of the Lord. And that everything belongs to the Lord, and that philosophically speaking, there's no need to say, should we choose material reality or spiritual reality? Should we say that God is real or the world is real? No, one has become many, and all this differentiation is possible. And that for inanimate things, they simply are dependent on the Lord. And for many things, certain kinds of animals and the plants and trees and so on, they're simply dependent on the life force within them. But Ramanuja's teaching, and much of it that drove his teaching, was to say, but human beings are in a position to decide their fate or their destiny. And you can, on the one hand, choose to have a life of utter independence, ahamkara, I am myself, I am alone by myself, there's nothing but me, I'm independent. Or you can realize that according to the truth of the Upanishads, everything is interconnected. And that really who I am is, as to use the Sanskrit word, shesha. I am a particle of, a remnant of the Lord. I belong to the Lord. And therefore you go from this sense of autonomy, being swatantra, to being somebody who is a dasa, a servant of the Lord, belonging to the Lord. The beautiful phrase in Tamil is adiyen. Adi is a word for foot, and the adiyen, I who am at the feet. I who am at the feet of the Lord is my self-definition. They also play with the idea that you're also at the feet of every other devotee because they also are at the feet of the Lord. So the sense of the interconnectedness of all beings as belonging to the Lord. And a subcategory of that is to say that since the Lord is the ultimate reality, every time we use human language, we're really speaking in some way about God. So again, the Chandogya Upanishad, which is so important for all the Vedanta schools, there's that passage at the beginning of 6 where Shvetaketu is being educated by his father. And you recall the analogy. Everything made of clay is really clay. You can call it a plate made of clay, a pot made of clay, a cup made of clay. But you're also realizing that all of the things that are made of clay are still clay. And that even more basically, clay exists. So whenever you say, bring me a cup made of clay or iron or some other substance, copper or whatever, you're bringing something that has a form and a name, but then it's also iron or clay or some simpler substance, and then you're talking about what is. And I think this would be very common ground with Shankara and other Vedantins. But he says, well, where does is come from? Where does what is come from? From the Lord. And therefore, if you realize what you're doing, everything you see leads you to the Lord. And every word you use, ultimately, if you understand it properly, becomes speech about God. So this is both a high mystical claim. Imagine if we actually live that way, that everything we see around us is somehow a manifestation of God. And every word we say is really ultimately God talk, or talking about God. Philosophically, it's a very powerful position, but I think it's a kind of mystical position. And the stories talk about, as they will with any of these great teachers, Ramanuja's youth, the unique nature of him as an individual. But the idea that in his philosophy, in his theology, in his spirituality, also in building the community, he wanted people to have this very wide sense of openness to the reality of God everywhere. And therefore, although he seemed in his life to be concerned about keeping caste distinctions, that people could be bhaktas or devotees or prapannas, surrendered to the Lord, any man, any woman, any caste, low caste, outcast, high caste, whatever, even though he seemed to be saying that socially speaking, we can keep these distinctions for various reasons, that what matters deep down is just as the cup and the plate are really the same reality, so too the Brahman and the pariah are the same reality, namely devotees of the Lord. And in some way that, I think, opened the door to say everybody is welcome in Vaishnavism. Of course, it depends on the Vaishnavas, in any given age, whether the Vaishnavas are in fact truly open-minded or sectarian or rigid. And I've met, as with Roman Catholics, I've met people across the spectrum from very open-minded to very closed-minded. And that's natural. But I think what Ramanuja was doing is kind of inspiring this great openness. God is in all things, and everything we say is really speaking of God. And the consciousness that comes with that allows us to remain in the world. Shankara's tradition was largely not a sannyasa tradition. He had a difficult relationship with his wife and finally sent her back to her family and lived as a sannyasi for much of his very long life. But most of the Sri Vaishnavas I've met are married. Even the great acharyas have families. And I think for Ramanuja it was rather you gain a kind of detachment in the midst of family life. You gain a detachment in the midst of everything you do as a householder and so on like that. Some people, like the Alvars, seem to be truly renunciants. And Ramanuja, as I said, became one. But nonetheless, this sense of kind of a larger sense of society as we live in it becomes a sacred reality. And that's, I think, very beautiful. To turn then to his works, and I think one of the advantages of reading Ramanuja is that there are only 9 works attributed to him. So with Shankara, it seems hundreds of works are attributed to Shankara. Shankara, obviously the Bhashya on the Brahma Sutras, but also the commentary on the major Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upadesha Sahasri, and then other works. And I think there are at least 100 or more attributed to Shankara. Ramanuja, just 9. And I think they fall into 2 divisions. And while I won't, in the next few minutes, try to go deeply into the divisions or the content of the text, because this is not the occasion for that, but to realize there are 2 kinds of works that he did. And the first kind is the kind that always gets the attention when people talk about Ramanuja, his commentarial works and his establishment of the Vishishtadvaita philosophy. So by tradition, his first work was called the Vedanta Sangraha, kind of the summary of the meaning of the Veda. And although he did not write commentaries on the individual Upanishads, he does in this work try to spell out what exactly the Upanishads are about, how to read properly Brihadaranyaka, Chandogya, Kena, Katha, and other Upanishads, and understand them as part of this reality of what God is like. And he's a fierce polemicist at spots. He argues against Bhaskara's Beda, his old teacher Yadava Prakasha, he argues against him, and at least by tradition he's arguing against Shankara, or some disciple of Shankara whose work he read. So part of it can be quite fierce, but the idea is basically to say, look, we're living in places like Sri Rangam, we're living with this double heritage of Tamil, Sanskrit, Vedanta, and although he doesn't mention the Tamil in his writings, trying to create a way of reading the Upanishads that isn't schizophrenic. Like I go to the temple, I worship in the temple, I'm a devotee, and then I read the Upanishads, which are only about Atman Brahman. No, that the Upanishads can be read as ultimately pointing to the reality of Vishnu Narayana with Lakshmi. And so he starts off with this little work, which supposedly he either wrote or dedicated to the Lord at Tiruvenkatam, Tirupati. And so he began in this very holy place, the other great center of Vaishnavism, Tirupati and Sri Rangam. There, and he sort of gave this work to the Lord and says, this is the true meaning of the Upanishads. And then everything followed from there. Like Shankara, he wrote a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. And it's easier, I think, for him to comment on the Gita because the Gita itself seems so devotional. And at the core of it is this teachings of Sri Krishna and come to me, think of me, put your mind upon me, take refuge at my feet, and the Charma Shloka at the end, 1866. All of this has come to me. But he spelled out again how there's no incompatibility between the teaching of the Gita and teaching of the Upanishads, that they go together. It's a very beautiful book. It's very parallel to Shankara's commentary, but both of them are worth reading. And then, of course, his great work, the Sri Bhashya. which is his commentary on the Brahma Sutras, the work of Badarayana that organizes all the Upanishads and shows that there's no contradiction among the Upanishads, that meditating on them is fruitful, that you can meditate on them repeatedly, and this leads you to the path toward heaven and release and moksha. So he does a commentary, again, very similar to Shankara. At points they seem to argue. He differentiates himself from Advaita. But my guess, and I haven't actually quantified this, is that 90% or more of the time they agree on the interpretation of the Brahma Sutras. So it's not chasmic, a chasm between the two of alternate realities, but rather largely agreeing with some differentiation. What I was amazed to find in recent years, reading Vedanta Deshika, a later Vaishnava teacher, a great teacher, and others, is that some Vaishnavas consider the Sri Bhashya, the commentary on the sutras, to be spiritual reading, which is remarkable. It's like saying you have this big, heavy book, it strains your eyes and gives you headaches to read it, and it's all very technical theology. Vedanta Deshika, in a work called the Yatiraj Saptati, the 70 verses for Yatiraj, the king of ascetics, who's Ramanuja, says reading the Sri Bhashya is like sipping honey. Reading it is like pure ambrosia. Reading the Sri Bhashya brings tears to your eyes. And I think it's an acquired taste. It may bring tears to your eyes for the wrong reason when you start reading it. Like, I can't read this, I don't know what he's talking about. But it seems to be the conviction of the teachers of the tradition who study this and teach it and pass down, that the deeper you get into it, the more it opens you to the reality of what God is like. And I'll quote a passage later on as I finish. But the idea that the Sri Bhashya is somehow spiritually charged as well as intellectually charged is very important. There are two other little works, the Deepa and the Sara, Vedanta Sipa, Vedanta Sara, which are just summaries of Sri Bhashya. We can leave those aside. Now, often scholars, particularly Western scholars, stop there and says, so he wrote a commentary on the Brahma Sutras, on the Gita, and his summary of the Upanishads. That's the real Ramanuja. But there are 4 other works attributed to him, which I think is foolish to ignore a tradition over 900 years old, that Ramanuja wrote devotional works as well. And these are quite beautiful, and they've been translated somewhat in various ways. The 3 Gadyas, the 3 prose works of praise. So you have the Sharanagati Gadyam, the prayer of surrender, taking refuge. The Sri Ranga Gadya, which is really taking refuge at Sri Rangam Temple. And then the Sri Vaikunta Gadya, which is the prayer of eternal refuge in heaven. And these are long prayers. It's peculiar that they're in prose, not poetry, but that's a different issue. But nonetheless, they're simply heavily theologically informed, spiritually rich, mystical poetry. Mystical prayers that are meant to reinforce this idea of belonging to God and finding your way to God. And I'll just read you a passage or two from the I'll just read a little bit of the Sri Sharanagati Gadyam just to give you a feel of this text, and then I'll come back to it later. And this is early on in the text. The Sharanagati Gadyam opens with prayer to Sri Lakshmi, saying, please be my intercessor, my Parushakara, allow me to approach the Lord. And she says in the text, so be it, do so. And this is then the way he begins to speak to Vishnu directly. Your proper form is opposite to everything that is evil. You are the sole abode of all that is auspicious. You are different from all beings that depend upon you. You are purely consciousness and bliss without any limit, echoing the Taittiriya Upanishad. Your divine form, a single form appropriate and pleasing to yourself, is a treasury of unimaginable, divine, wonderful, flawless, permanent, unsurpassed, and excellent qualities. Splendor, beauty of features, fragrance, tenderness, handsome personality, and youth. You are filled with all good qualities, and it goes on a long list of qualities, including straightforwardness, good-heartedness, sameness, compassion, sweetness, profoundness, generosity, firmness, heroic valor, Your desires come true, your intentions are realized. You are the consort of Sri, who herself is the host of innumerable auspicious qualities. You are pleasing to her and she is pleasing to you. You are the consort of Bhumi and Nila, the other two devas. You are the Lord of Vaikuntha, which itself, he goes on to talk about how beautiful Vaikuntha is. And on in this way. And I think part of it is when we make the distinction Nirguna, Saguna. And Shankara is the great teacher of Nirguna Brahman. The Saguna is not simply an explanation of why the Upanishads use words sometimes that seem to say that there are qualities to the divine, but that for the sake of your prayer and your meditation, you can begin to visualize what God is like. You begin to be able to see that God is beautiful, that God is generous, that God is firm and strong, that God is like a mother to children. But even further passages that remarkably talk much more vividly as if we're in a temple setting, that there's actually a murti, a form to God that is not temporary but permanent. This is a beautiful related passage from the Gita, commentary, Gita Bhashya, at the end of the 9th chapter, which is one of the more beautiful chapters. This is where he says at the end, where in 9:34, the last verse of chapter 9, Krishna says, "Fix your mind on me." So put your mind entirely on me. This is what Ramanuja says. This means that you should fix your mind entirely on the Lord of Lords. He is the auspicious abode opposite to everything that is to be avoided. He is the knower of everything. All his intentions come true. He is the only cause of the entire universe. He is the highest Brahman, the highest person. And then it gets much more vivid. He has large eyes shaped like a lotus petal. His complexion is like a clear blue cloud. His radiance is like that of 1,000 suns simultaneously risen. He is a great ocean of the nectar of beauty. He has 4 arms. He is noble and strong. He is dressed in brilliant yellow raiment. He is ordained with a pure crown. He has crocodile-shaped earrings, garlands, arm bracelets, bangles on his wrists. He is an ocean of mercy, affability, beauty, sweetness, majesty, magnanimity, and the affection of a mother for her children. And therefore, he is the refuge of all without exception and without partiality. He is the supreme Lord of all. Therefore, fix your mind on me continuously, like a stream of oil flowing uninterrupted. And this comes up in the Sri Bhashya too. What is meditation? You visualize the Lord and you hold it, like a yogic practice of dharana. And it's like a stream of oil, that very thin, but it doesn't break. It's not drops, but it's a continuous stream. So you imagine the Lord in your mind with all his great qualities and then the features of him, his beauty, the lotuses, the earrings, and so on. And you just hold him in your mind and you imagine him. And what's beautiful about the Gadyas and then passages like I just read from the Gita Bhashya is that there's a sense in which the intellectual, the spiritual, and the practical go together. That if you can defend, as Ramanuja is defending, that there is a positivity to God. So God is beyond our imagination. Neti neti means that you can never hold God in your hand. God is not a thing in the world. But that as you imagine God, you use your mystical consciousness, your higher understanding, but that everything you consider beautiful is still part of God. So the colors, the taste, the smell, the visions, the voice, the music, all of these things are held in your vision of God. And therefore your true meditation is not in emptiness or simply a pure consciousness without images, but it's this complete, in a sense, the Vishwarupa of chapter 11 of the Gita in a less terrifying form, in the sense in which the beauty of God floods your imagination and becomes part of who you are. Now I want to stop shortly because I want to have questions and so on. In a longer presentation I could say, well, this is not just in the devotional Gita Bhashya, but even in the Sri Bhashya, that Ramanuja is teaching about the nature of devotion and the true meaning of the Upanishads, the true meaning of Atman Brahman, is also developed in the Sri Bhashya in terms of the ability to come to see God and to come very close to who God is. There's a beautiful passage toward the beginning in the so-called Lagu Purvapaksha Lagu Siddhanta, the short argument at the beginning, where he's talking about, can God be visualized? What does meditation really mean? And he's echoing the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, Darshana. You hear or you read the word, you think on it, you meditate on it, and then you see. And he says, well, what this really means is that meditation is a long, loving look at God that's just like pratyaksha. It's just like perception. And that deep down, if we truly can perceive the world, if we truly understand the Veda, and if we persist in doing it, it becomes as if there's this kind of face-to-face encounter with God. And you begin to see God. And in that beginning passage in the Sri Bhashya, he doesn't give any details, nothing about earrings or eyes or anything. But he's defending the possibility that there's this kind of opening into the beauty of God. And that the point of prayer, the point of meditation, is using your words, using your thoughts, using your meditation so that you can see God and God can see you. And this kind of back and forth. So I think you see my point is that in the Gadyas, in the Sharanagati Gadyam, the Sri Rangam, which is shorter, set at the temple at Sri Rangam, and then in the Vaikuntha Gadya in heaven, this idea again is that you begin to have not only a theoretical but also an emotional, experiential sense of what God is like. And you envision God in this fashion. And in all three texts, and this should not be surprising at this point, the climax is always taking refuge at the feet of the Lord. So you begin to see what God is like, you envision God, you contemplate God, you see God everywhere. What is the response? You realize, I truly belong to the Lord. As I said before, adiyen, I am at the feet of the Lord, so I finally throw myself down at the Lord's feet. And so in that passage I was reading from the Sharanagati Gadyam, the passage where I stopped reading, it ends this way. And this is very typical of Ramanuja. You are the reality of all beings, ceaselessly known. You are intent upon ordering all moving and unmoving things without exception. All your desires come true. All your intentions are realized. You are different from everything. You are the wishing tree for those who want. You are the friend of everyone in distress. And then you are Narayana with Sri. And in the Sanskrit, Sri comes first, because Sri always is the way to Narayana. You are the refuge of those who have no refuge. Therefore, I who have no refuge surrender at your two lotus feet. And I think what he wants at that point, because he says, here you recite the Dvaya mantra, the other great mantra of the Vaishnavas, is you're reciting this prayer and you're remembering all the qualities of the Lord and all the beauties and levels of reality, and then you throw yourself down, either at the feet in your home shrine or in the temple, at the feet of the Lord, or just mentally, you see the Lord and then you surrender to the Lord. And that's what it's about. And so why is it that Shankara and Ramanuja think differently on certain points? There are many reasons for that, I suppose, but for Ramanuja, it has to do, can we defend bhakti? Can we defend prapatti as total surrender, sharanagati? And the whole reality is really to be focused on making you the kind of person who can surrender to the Lord, who will then take care of you as a mother takes care of her child. And so it's a very beautiful system that finally, by the end of it, really goes back into parallelism with the works of the Alvars, which are full of such expressions in Tamil of taking refuge, surrendering to the Lord, the beauty of the Lord, and so on. And although he never quotes from Tamil works, he's really kind of creating a space in which, if you understand the Sanskrit, you end up in the same place as the Tamil. And then his disciples, beginning with Pillan, and then next generation, Periyavachan Pillai, Nam Pillai, later Pillai Lokacharya, Vedanta Deshika, and so on, begin to spell out by reading the Tamil and the Sanskrit together explicitly about how all of this holds together. I mentioned 8 works of his. I'll stop in a moment by referring to his 9th work. And this one, I'm happy to say it has amazingly, there's only one very bad translation of it in English, the Nityam, the Nitya Grantham, which is the book of daily worship. And I'm happy to say that I have a translation coming out. It'll be in the International Journal of Hindu Studies of this text, coming out in a few months. which could be another bad translation, but I'll try my best to make it a good translation. But this is the work that Ramanuja has, and again, Western scholars tend to ignore it and say, well, this is devotionalism, it's not that interesting. But in which he begins by saying, this is the daily practice of the advanced devotee, the paramaikanti, the one who's entirely focused on the Lord. This is the daily practice. And then he goes on to describe, and it's about 10 pages long only in Sanskrit, although some devotees in Madras and elsewhere have complained that it would take you hours to do it if you really did it right. And that's why they do shorter versions of it. But it's basically a puja. You put yourself in the presence of the Lord. You visualize the Lord several times over. And then you, on one level, you kind of worship your way up to the Lord. You start with the Muladhara, as in Tantra or yoga, like the base reality, the Prakriti and so on, and you go all the way up through the universe doing namaskarams in all directions until you reach the feet of Sri and Vishnu. And then you reverse the process and you come back down to earth. And then with your murti, and it's not clear if it means a physical murti, let's say in your home, or one in the temple, or just one in your mind, you then do regular puja with all the instruments of puja, the water, the incense, the flowers, you offer food and so on like that. You do all of this, and you do this every day, and it always ends with this idea of taking refuge at the feet of the Lord. So his point seems to be that once in your life you do your real prapatti. You surrender to the Lord, even if you're a householder, whether you're young or old, in-caste or out-caste, whatever, you surrender to the Lord. And that's enough. You just do it once. There's no need to do it more than once. But then every day for the rest of your life, you repeat it. You go back to the experience and you live out the vow again. You live out the surrender to the Lord, which is beautiful for me as a Christian. So as you said in introducing me, Diane said in introducing me, I'm a Jesuit priest, and we take vows as Jesuits of poverty, chastity, obedience. We rely on the Lord, live according to the vows, and so on like that. And we do it once. So I did it, I was 20 years old when I did my vows, a long time ago. But we're encouraged to do them devotionally over and over again every year. So you don't add anything to the original vows. You don't, possibility of changing your mind or anything, no. But you go back to the moment of surrender and you repeat it again and again. And for me as a Christian, it rings well with what Ramanuja is talking about here, that you begin to understand the world differently, you read the scriptures differently, you read in the classical language, you read in your own language, you realize all of this leads you to God, you surrender to God, then you go about your business, you do what life calls you to do, and then every day you return to that experience and you renew and affirm your surrender again. And so I won't go through details because this text too talks about surrendering. One of the images he uses, you see in many of these texts, dandavat, like a stick, you fall down. Now, I would not risk doing that. I'm afraid I'd break my nose or something like that. But nonetheless, the idea is that without any other dependence, you simply give yourself to the Lord and you prostrate yourself. And doing this every day creates a psychological state of dependence on the Lord. I close, and then we'll have plenty of time, I think, for questions and discussion, by pointing out what I was just alluding to, that Ramanuja is extremely interesting to Christians and to Roman Catholics, and Shankara in a different way. That would be a different occasion. But to think of Ramanuja from a Christian viewpoint is to see a series of resemblances and recognitions in which we can say, yes, that's like something we do, or that's like something we believe. Or when my founder of my order, St. Ignatius Loyola, had the saying that we see God in all things, we find God in all things, like what Ramanuja said. There's even a passage in the first letter of John that I want to read to you that is calling us to a vision of God as central to our life. See the love that God has given us, that we should be called the children of God. For that is what we truly are, even if we do not know it. Beloved, we are God's children now, but what we will be has not yet been revealed to us. What we do know is this: when God is revealed to us, we will be like God, for we will see God as he is. And this seems to me, from the Bible, words that Ramanuja could say yes. We have this orientation to God. It's truly who we are. We often don't know this. We think of God as far away, a distant figure. But the more we see, the more God is close to us, the more we realize my reality and the reality of God belong together. And the more we understand what God is like, the more we become like that ourselves. And I think that kind of recognition, the back and forth between a Christian text and the Gita and the Alvars and Ramanuja's understanding, means that he's a friendly pilgrim, a co-pilgrim. You might say somebody we can learn from without losing Christian faith or Buddhist faith or Muslim faith or other faiths, but rather learn from him and then say, this helps us to understand better even things we thought we understood already. So I think he's a beautiful figure. He doesn't replace Shankaracharya, certainly, in any way, but nonetheless opens the door to thinking about Vedanta in a different way, and then opens the door for a different kind of interreligious understanding as well. Thank you. So we have questions now? Is that?
Yep.
Yeah, my name is Girish. I'm confused as to whether Vishishtadvaita is considered dualist or non-dual, in the sense that if only God exists and is in everything, then it would be non-dual, there would be only one. But at the same time, it seems to admit of a physical, object-filled world.
Yeah.
And a manifestation as opposed to an appearance within. Brahman, which is Vedic. So would you expound on that?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, a difficult one, but basically I think an understanding of how to read Chandogya chapter 6, where in the beginning there was one without a second, Advitiyam, and this one became many. It remains one, but it manifests itself in differentiation of fire, water, earth, and other things. And what Ramanuja seems to be saying with the text is that everything remains one because God is the only true reality. But God, whose wishes come true, who does whatever he intends, wishes to be material reality, wishes to be spiritual realities, conscious beings. And therefore, it's a qualification. He never used the term Vishishtadvaita, Ramanuja, but rather that there are trees and flowers and birds, there is earth, there is fire, there is water, there is air, there are rocks, there are stars, and so on. There are innumerable conscious beings, animals, ourselves, there are gods. But that the mistake would be to say we have a fragmentary Dvaita universe in which everything is separate, but rather the deep reality is that everything belongs to God, returns to God, and therefore in that sense there's only one reality, God. But it's not the dissolution or entire eradication of difference, but rather, like for a human being, what we do is we surrender totally to God. That puts us back where we belong, but for all eternity, he would say in Vaikuntha, we are in this loving relationship to God, inside God, but not obliterated by God. So I think some people might, characterize, let's say, a certain kind of Advaita as having Brahman and Maya, and the world, and I don't think this is Shankara's view, but a merely illusory reality. Shankara, would be another talk, but Ramanuja sees that diversity is real, but it's utterly dependent on God, and therefore, in that sense, one. Thank you.
Professor, I'm very impressed that I learned a lot.
Take the mic, please.
Oh. I am thinking, Professor, I'm very impressed because I learned a lot from you today. And I'm very grateful. The one question I have, because I don't know what is your own experience and your full learning about Thakur. Because Ramanuja was a theoretical knowledge he expressed towards the mankind, but Thakur Sri Ramakrishna gave us practical experience. What is Andrea? What is your gift? don't have to.
So what is my view of Sri Ramakrishna? Okay. Well, that's another lecture also. I think on the one level, again, what I was trying to communicate today is something of the uniqueness of Ramanuja, his location, who was a very practical man by tradition, because he reformed the temple worship, he fixed up Sri Rangam, he built this wider community and so on like that. And I think, and I'm sure this, probably Swami Vivekananda has said this somewhere, is that these different sampradayas and different pathways have a genius that arises in a certain time, and then some of them continue to have purpose over generations and even millennia. There's an argument to say that, well, in the 19th century, Shankara was still relevant, Ramanuja was still relevant, the Alvars was still relevant, and so on, but that there was special conditions and a need for another manifestation of who God is. And that the coming of Sri Ramakrishna in 1836 in his 50 years of life was a way of dealing with 19th century Bengal, the changes, the British, the coming of Christianity, and another way of kind of beginning to envision how the different religions and different parts of reality fit together. So in a way that you wouldn't expect for Shankara and Ramanuja, the vivid stories of Sri Ramakrishna trying different pathways, and the famous encounter where he meditated on the Madonna and heard reading from the Bible, and then encountered Jesus in the garden. Those are scenes that you wouldn't expect in earlier generations. And I think it was his way of testifying to the possibility that from your own faith and tradition, you can enter deeply into the other and you can become one. And then I think in some ways, as St. Paul took the message of Jesus to the wider world, Swami Vivekananda, kind of his universal Vedanta for the West and so on, is taking Sri Ramakrishna's vision for a wider world in which not everyone is a great mystic as Sri Ramakrishna was. So I think these different figures have different charisms that carry on in different time periods. And that, again, there's not competition that, well, if Shankara is right, then Ramanuja is wrong, or if Ramanuja is good, then who needs Ramakrishna? No, that these are different periods. And some people, as say with rasas or tastes, my taste is more for this, my taste is more for that. And I think the possibilities remain open for so many people.
Thank you for your talk, Professor. Works.
With regard to, from a devotee's perspective, in Advaita Vedanta there is just the divine presence, right? And everything else that looks like a diversity is Maya or illusion. So when for a devotee to realize God from an Advaita Vedanta perspective, is to be able to understand or realize that this diversity is an illusion and that there is only God in everything, or everything is God. So how does Ramanuja explain from a Vishishtadvaita perspective this self-realization of who you really are?
So I think I mentioned his early work, the Vedartha Sangraha, the meaning of the Upanishads, and then his interpretation in the Brahma Sutra, Sri Bhashya, of the sutras and so on. I think again and again what he's trying to say is that, as I answered the first question, was that there is only one reality, the reality of God. But God chooses that there be differences within the reality of God. And so, again, I don't think it's easy to just say that Shankara was a Mayavadan, but rather than saying that the world is illusion or nothing but God exists, as I repeated before, in the Chandogya Upanishad, in the beginning was one ekam advitiyam, one reality, which said, Bahusyam, may I become many. And the fire was real, the water was real, the earth was real, the eggs were real, things that grew out of them were real. Shwetaketu and his father were real in a certain way, but entirely dependent. And so, again, spelled out very at length in the Vedartha Sangraha, saying that there are different passages in the Upanishads. Some seem to point to absolute non-duality. Others seem clearly to point to some kind of diversification. How can we hold these together? By saying that the one reality of God is a reality that emanates itself and becomes many in a real way, but everything that comes from God is utterly dependent on God and therefore has to return to God. And so that's why the prapatti, or surrender, is important. It's not just a pious thing you do on the side, but it's rather recognizing I, who am an individual, am totally at the feet of the Lord, belong to the Lord. Again, I don't go poof and then disappear, but that my reality is I belong to God, God has included me in God's reality, and I am part of the reality of God. So it's a kind of non-dualism, but it has its certain character, and maybe that's why people talk about Vishesha or Vishishta. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. My name is Bill. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I am also kind of a Roman Catholic. I know you can't really say that, but so I read Saint Teresa of Avila, and I also read Swami Vivekananda. My question, you've kind of been answering it, so forgive me if this is repetitive. How do you reconcile your Catholicism, your Christianity with Vedanta in your mind, I guess, even personally? And I guess I'm looking for a way to find my course here. I guess you probably understand.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, so I think this excellent question, how do you reconcile different views of the world, different religious systems with one another, when both many people think you have to make a choice, you're either this or that, period, or they're clearly contradictory on certain points. And I think that's a reality that no one is allowed to just dismiss and say, oh, don't worry about that. I think in my personal experience, I first, after I did my BA as a young Jesuit seminarian, I went to Kathmandu for 2 years and taught in a high school where all the boys were Hindu and Buddhist. So starting in 1973, I have all my life been thinking about being Catholic, being a Jesuit, being a priest, being committed in light of my experience of and study of Hinduism. And I think for me it's been useful that it was kind of existentially rooted in being there first. So I didn't just get a book out of the library and read about Vedanta and then say, well, this disagrees with this, so which one am I going to follow? If this is true, that must be false. But some kind of an experience of saying, here I am in Kathmandu in a Hindu Buddhist country, and I still seem to be a Catholic, and still seem to be planning to be ordained a priest, and so on. And that it's possible to be, I think what I found then and still hold is that if you try to resolve it on a conceptual level, then you can say, is it one or many? Even is Vishnu, Narayana, Sri Narayana the deity, or is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit the deity? So which one are you going to choose? And I was just at Mass this morning at St. Paul's Church at Columbus Circle, and we say the creed, and I remain committed in the Catholic faith. But the relationship to Hinduism in general, and then to Ramanuja in particular, and the Alvars and so on, is not worked out conceptually in terms of this is true, that's not true, they're both true, neither of them are true, etc. But rather to say, existentially, I who have this commitment and live this way, I keep learning from the other endlessly. And when I go to Hindu temples, I keep learning from it, the beauty of it, the music moves me, the puja moves me. And there's a level in which, well, that's contradictory, and you know it probably, and I know Catholics who would never do anything like I do, or you do, or never go to a Hindu temple. It's not possible. And I say, well, I think that's a kind of rational reduction of the possibilities. Whereas to say, just as reality is diverse, I find in my experience that it's possible to be here with my Roman collar, wearing it next to Sri Ramakrishna, that I needn't say either take the collar off or take the picture down, but rather there's a way in which there's a beauty of the nearness to one another that you have to be careful of, to avoid kind of syncretizing and saying, oh, they're both the same anyway. It doesn't make any difference. Or to say, none of them are true. Or to say, this is true and that is false, but to live with a sense of the possibilities and say, it's not given to me or given to you to, make an ultimate judgment up or down, but rather, to read back and forth, to pray back and forth, to learn as best you can with a sense of your own limits. I can go no further, I cannot do that, but I can do this and this and this. And that's often, it sounds trivial, but good enough. You go as far as you can and you stop there. So that's sort of the way I handle it, to be able to say this is real enough and deep enough that you can live with a certain level of non-rational resolution, but that instinctively, spiritually, you find something that makes this possible.
Thank you for your excellent talk. My name is Gordon, and in building on what you just said, I wonder how far you can go. And my question has to do with godless mysticism. Buddhism, Taoism are the most notable, even though there may be an object to meditate upon that has Brahmanic qualities, shall we say, or invested with some kind of high level of attraction. How do you make the bridge to those kinds of practices and institutions?
I think, so in terms of, in some ways it's easier with Ramanuja or the Alvars, and there's a certain sense in which, Christian and Jewish or Christian and Muslim have certain resonances and commonalities. Well, what about the East Asian religions? What about Taoism? What about, as you say, Buddhism or Jainism? And I think, to be honest with you, I've spent my life studying Hinduism, not Buddhism, and not Jainism, not Taoism, with a recognition that if I was to, and I won't at this point, that would be a whole different set of issues and challenges arising. I think some of the same basic values, like keep an open mind, keep your own spiritual grounding, believe that you can learn from the Taoist or the Buddhist, but that the limit would come in terms of, could I really see the world as a Buddhist does, or really understand shunyata or emptiness? And it could be that it's so different that I cannot go there. And that it's not necessary for me to go there. So I'm saying within one finite life and one finite set of possibilities, I do this. But if somebody said, well, my goal in life when I'm 20 years old is to engage Taoism, then there would be a journey there of how do you do that if you still want to be a Hindu or a Christian, let's say. So I'm admitting the difficulty, but also saying you can't do everything. And you shouldn't say, well, because I did this, therefore it's just the same as that, just the same as that. It remains different. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Thiari. I wanted to ask, you said that while meditation, the image of God will flood your imagination, and then you proceeded to describe a certain image of God that Ramanuja described with eyes like lotuses and his color blue as a cloud. So I wanted to ask if Ramanuja thinks that there is freedom for me to imagine God as something different than what he described, or if he thinks that that is the absolute form of God, or if there's freedom for one to imagine God as something else or choose to not visualize God at all.
It's an excellent question. And I think obviously there are possibilities that come up 1,000 years later that Ramanuja did not anticipate. Regularly in the Vedanta Sangraha, the Gita Bhashya, Sri Bhashya a little bit, and then in the Gadyas and the Nitya Grantham, it's the same kind of imagery that comes up all the time. So again, the earrings, the crown, the hair, the eyes, the Kaustubha gem on the chest and so on like that. He doesn't give any indication that you could imagine entirely a different look. So in some ways it may be based on his own cultural location and tradition. This is what God looks like. He knows, though, and he clearly keeps in mind, there's a passage in the Vishnu Purana, in the last book, chapter 7, where you have this long process of a visualization of what God is like. And you have it with the earrings and the crown and so on. So this is a Sanskrit text, Vishnu Purana. And you make it as complicated as possible. And then the next part is, little by little, you remove parts. So you get rid of the arms, you get rid of the crown, rid of the earrings, rid of the lotuses and so on, until finally you come to a simple, empty reality. And the Vishnu Purana seems to be saying that you can make it multiple and saguna, and then part of your meditation can make it nirguna. Now Ramanuja, he never discusses this at great length, but he quotes from the passage. So he seems to have some idea you can expand and contract, expand and contract. I think the problem, the question then for a 21st century person would be, well, suppose I have a different image of what God is like. Can I do the same? I mean, in my tradition, Catholic Jesuit tradition, we're encouraged to meditate and contemplate what Jesus is like. And so as Sri Ramakrishna did, well, what does Jesus look like? And how did he dress? And what did he say? And so on like that. I think it could be carried over. Some of the same practices could work with a different image. But Ramanuja himself doesn't say that. So I think it would be a matter in the 21st century to say, could we use, is that just culturally conditioned images? And that now we could do it in a different way. I think you can, but he doesn't explicitly say you can do that. And thank you, a good question. Yes, sir.
Lately a book came out calling Infinite Paths to Infinite God, and he talks about Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. And for the life of me, I can't make a distinction between Vishishtadvaita and Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, and I wonder if you can differentiate them, or do you think they're the same?
So this is a fascinating book. Swami, are you in the book of essays responding to it? There's a... Yeah. Ayon Maharaj, who's a young Swami. I've looked at the book, and I had to write a response to it. I think it's a journal issue that maybe it's for. So this idea of arguing kind of with strong philosophical connotations, the vijnana, this kind of insight into the nature of reality that Ramakrishna stands for. I'd have to have the book here to remember the details. But I think in a way you would expect there to be kind of a friendly alliance between Ramakrishna and Ramanuja on this, is that reality is one. You don't need to deny the Upanishads and so on, but that there's a way of seeing the world not only with jnana but with vijnana. You perceive deeper into reality and you see the interconnectedness of things. The book is very complicated because he's dealing with analytic philosophy, British analytic philosophy and so on. But I think, Ramakrishna was not a Gaudiya Vaishnava. The Gaudiya Vaishnavas of Bengal are clearly indebted to Ramanuja, so he's a different tradition. But there may be, if you have a conception that there is an ultimate deity who is not impersonal, then a way of thinking about the world within the reality of the mother or within Sri Narayana, you're going to end up with some parallels. But I think that would be the kind of thing either to ask Ayon Maharaj about Ramanuja. He's very good on email, you could ask him. Or to sit down and say, okay, we often make comparisons between Advaita Vedanta and Sri Ramakrishna. Now if you do a more concerted study of Advaita, of Ramanuja and Sri Ramakrishna, what other resemblance would you notice, even though Ramakrishna was not a Vaishnava? So I think you're onto something big, but it's also a very complicated thing to follow up on. Thank you.
Professor, in Gita they said the Sarguna Swarup is easy to worship than Nirguna Swarup. Now, is any advantage or Nirguna Swarup or Saguna Swarup?
Is there any advantage to the Nirguna Saguna?
Yeah.
Well, I think Again, this would be a different context, but I think you can say, well, one advantage is that I think there's a purity to the insight of Shankara, in which the nirguna is to get kind of back to the ultimate reality and to see pure being, Satchit Ananda, Satchit Anantam, seeing the reality as it is without any of the conditionings of names and forms and so on. And there's this kind of direct perception of reality that becomes ultimate. And I think obviously that has advantages because it's been renowned for thousands of years, and people follow this path, and people live lives that are beautiful and persuasive that way. I think what Ramanuja is saying, because his cultural location, his religious location as a Vaishnava in Tamil Nadu, is really to argue that the saguna should not be trivialized as a lesser state for lower down people. Because you can say, well, for the crowds, if they can't get nirguna, then they can settle for saguna. Ramanuja, I think, is saying, no, this is the way reality is, and this is, again, a point of disagreement, but that to see that God is not the one beyond the many, but that everything in the many is manifestations of God, real but dependent on God, is a way of saying the saguna has its own kind of spirituality, spiritual practice to go with it that works very well. So even when we talk about what's the difference between Hindu and Christian, can you appreciate saguna and nirguna together, Ramanuja and Shankara together? People often contrast them and say there's this school of Vedanta, that school of Vedanta. But in some way, I think it's also a challenge to say, if you're an Advaitin, how deeply can you learn from Ramanuja without it becoming polemical? And I think you can, but it takes work to actually begin by reading Ramanuja. That would be the start. So I think instead of polemicizing, and I don't mean that you did, but instead of saying, take your pick, nirguna, saguna, and then arguing, here are all the texts that prove it, to say, yes, they're both there in some way, and then can you move back and forth? And the Brahma Sutras try to do that. People like Bhaskara, Beda try to move back and forth. And I think in his own way, Ramanuja was trying to give it a certain reality, based also in his Tamil experience of being in the bhakti tradition of the Alvars. Yes?
No, Mr. Father, thank you for the talk. Sorry, the mic is good. I learned from your lecture that Sri Ramanuja appeals greatly to practicing Christians, and in what way? And you also mentioned that Shankara appeals for an entirely different reason. So I was just curious, in what way?
Well, I think if we had a blackboard here or a PowerPoint, we could start to discuss further. But it's interesting that since the 19th century, there have been probably more Christians and Catholics in India and the West interested in Shankara than interested in Ramanuja. And so starting with the famous Brahmabandha of Upadhyay, more or less a contemporary of Swami Vivekananda, who was a Hindu who became a Christian, became a Catholic, was interested in reviving the study of Shankara among Christians. And then in Calcutta, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, there was a famous series called To Christ Through the Vedanta. And they studied, Ramanuja, Shankara, Nimbarka, Madhva, and so on, Vallabha. But clearly their interest was, well, really Shankara is the greatest of all these figures. And they wanted to, experience and then struggle with Advaita Christianity, Christian Advaita. In the late 20th century, mid to late 20th century, Swami Abhishektananda, Henri Lassault, a French monk who helped found the ashram at Shantivanam, he was so impressed by Ramana Maharshi, who's another story, that he wanted to say, at its deepest mystery, the mystery of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, and the mystery of Tattvamasi and non-duality come together. And he had no interest at all in Ramanuja, or he was in Tamil Nadu, no interest in the Alvars, no interest in devotion, but it was very much about Advaitic experience as the really strongest, deepest form of Hindu. I think they were also challenged, it's different. Because I think they were afraid either Ramanuja is a competitor, like you worship Krishna or Jesus, or Ramanuja is sort of more or less the same thing as Thomas Aquinas or whatever, which is not quite true. But that Shankara is really, it was worth the trip to India, because Shankara is different and changes things. And so it's interesting, and I've been mentioning names. I can give you a bibliography of Christians who've tried to synthesize Advaita and Christian faith. But there's actually more of that than people who are interested in Ramanuja for some reason. Yeah.
One more question. I was just wondering how to put this in the context of Western approaches to consciousness. Is Ramanuja's approach similar in any way to panpsychism, perhaps, or some kind of monism?
I mean, there's a book that came out a few years ago on panentheism. So there's pantheism, and then there are various kinds of monism and dualism, but panentheism. So panentheism is that everything is in God, God is in everything, this kind of difference, non-difference view. And that, I'm not sure this is what you were asking, but in that context, process theology, Whitehead, Hartshorne, and so on, these philosophers of process, dynamic reality, evolving and changing, but one reality, not static, has been compared to Ramanuja's thought, or Ramanuja compared to them, in terms of the dynamics of the one and the many and the one. Pushing it psychologically and so on, I'm not sure about that, or I'm not the one to speak to that, but I think there was an effort to say that if you just have the category of polytheism, monism, theism, monotheism, you end up with static choices, this or this or this or this. But panentheism, again, a kind of process theology of everything evolving in God, was seen as closer to Ramanuja's thinking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's my happy duty to offer thanks to Professor Clooney, who is, by an amazing combination of circumstances, my teacher now. At Harvard, I'm taking his course, and the course is on the Upanishads, and the next course, which is greatly looked forward to, not only by me, but I have heard from other students from different schools, not just the Divinity School, but the Kennedy School of Government, from the college. This is a course on Ramanuja and Shankara, and that's happening in spring 2020. So I want Professor Clooney to sign me up. Right now I'm reserving a seat. So he's going to take up the Bhagavad Gita and study the commentary of Shankaracharya with the commentary of Ramanuja together, and that will be very interesting, very helpful for me personally at least. I have a very interesting experience on Tuesdays when we have Professor Clooney's Introduction to Upanishads class. We, from noon to 3 o'clock, 3 hours, we have Professor Garfield's Indo-Tibetan Buddhism class, the emptiness people. So, no God, certainly no Brahman, no Atman. The world is an illusion. It's an appearance. And if you talk about God, it's just irrelevant or even laughable there. And the next class, from 3 o'clock to nearly 6 o'clock, 5:45, 3 more hours almost, is God and Brahman and Upanishads and Atman. So I was saying that you can imagine my whiplash. I remember there's a good question. So many good questions. Just now, Professor Clooney was saying it made the discussion so rich. I was happy with the talk itself because we're going to put it on YouTube and it's going to be a resource, really. A lot of people are looking forward to this. Even in Harvard, they were asking and said you'll see it eventually on YouTube. And there was a very good question on Sri Ramakrishna and Ramanuja. I remember there was this great scholar of Vishishtadvaita, Lakshmi Tatacharya, who, like Professor Clooney, he said it takes 40 years to learn Ubhaya Vedanta, the Tamil and the Sanskrit Vedanta. He's been studying for 40 years. He came to give a talk on Vishishtadvaita at Belur Math. And it was a technical talk, so mostly monks, professors, we're all there. He said, I love reading the Kathamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And wait for it, next. Because, he said with big eyes and a booming voice, because obviously it is a Vishishtadvaita text. So he reads it openly, he's very happy with it as a Vishishtadvaita text. So that just speaks to how you can read Sri Ramakrishna. We are a little biased towards Advaita Vedanta because of our foundations in Shankara. That's how we were set on this track. That's how Sri Ramakrishna set Vivekananda on this track, and Vivekananda set us on this track. But I often say Ramakrishna is bigger than the Ramakrishna mission, the order, the monastic order. Somebody asked me, he practiced Tantra, a professor from Duke University. She said that Sri Ramakrishna practiced Tantra and so many Vaishnava disciplines. You guys keep talking about Advaita only. Why? And that's what I said to her, that this is the track we have been set on by Sri Ramakrishna himself through Vivekananda, very deliberately and clearly. But Sri Ramakrishna himself is much vaster than that. So thank you once again, Professor Clooney. I and many others there at Harvard, we are looking forward to next term's course also on Ramanuja and Shankara. And I hope we will have you again and again at this center in New York. Yes, a very big hand to all of you. Thank you.
Vande Vedanta Karpura Chamikara Karandakam Ramanujarya Maryanam Chudamani Maharnisham भगवन्नारायणाभिमतानुरूप स्वरूपरूपगुण विभवैश्वर्य शीलाद्यनवधिकातिशय असङ्ख्येय कल्याणगुणगणाम् पद्मवनालयाम् भगवतीम् श्रियम् देवीम् नित्यानपायिनीम् निरवद्यां देवदेव दिव्यमहिषीम् अखिलजगन्मातरम् अस्मन्मातरम् अशरण्यशरण्याम् अनन्यशरणः शरणमहं प्रपद्ये